Thesis on the impact of metadata on translator performance, how translators work with translation memories and machine translation. Before I give the floor to him, maybe I will just very briefly introduce myself. My name is Arndt Lucke Jacobsen. I come from the Copenhagen Business School. On my left, I have Professor Pilar Sanchez from UAB and Professor Ramon Piqué, also from UAB. But first, we're going to listen to a presentation of an outline, at least, of the PhD. So I'll give the floor to Carlos.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I will divide my presentation based on the structure of the thesis. I will condense the first chapter into one slide, where I present the object of the study and my motivations. Then I will have some slides on the methodology. Then I will present the results, divided into two parts. I will explain why later. And finally, I will present my conclusions. So the object of the thesis was to study how translators process the information provided by translation tools on screen. In other words, I'm studying the interaction between translators and translation tools. The main goal of this kind of study in general, and of my study in particular, is to learn how to improve workflows and practices, which in turn can lead to an increase in the volume of text that can be processed and reduce translation costs. This can have some advantages, for example, greater dissemination of information, wider access to foreign markets to companies selling their products abroad, broader access to legislation in national languages, and empowerment of speakers of minority languages. A second set of goals, which is not only related to productivity, comprise the ergonomics of translation tools. By enhancing the ergonomics of translation tools, we can reduce cognitive efforts for translators and increase their job satisfaction. And finally, a third goal, more specific of my study, was to inform other studies that compare translation memories and machine translation by looking into how metadata change the way that those types of suggestions are handled by translators. So my main research question was, what is the impact of translation metadata on translators' performances? In other words, what are the differences in the translation process between a situation where translators know the metadata about the translation suggestions and a situation where the metadata are not available. At this point, some definitions are necessary. For example, translation metadata, as I'm using it, refers to the information that appears on the interface of a translation tool to inform the user about several aspects of a translation task, in addition to the source text. I will show it later visually. And by translation suggestion, I'm referring to what is also known as proposals, the suggestions that come from translation memories and machine translation. I used three hypotheses in my thesis. The first one states that the presence of metadata affects translation time. And the first sub-hypothesis is that the effect of metadata on translation time varies in accordance with the type of translation suggestion. I will mention later what are the types of translation suggestions that I'm working with. The second hypothesis is about the effect of metadata on typing effort. And also, I'm stating that this effect varies in accordance with the type of translation suggestion. Finally, the third set of hypotheses states that the presence of metadata affects error score, and again, that the effect of metadata on error score varies in accordance with the type of translation suggestion. So here I have mainly three dependent variables: translation time, typing effort, and error score, and two explanatory variables: metadata and type of translation suggestion. The materials I used in the experiments are the following. A translation tool called IBM Translation Manager, 2 source texts for the 2 main tasks of around 500 words taken from a software manual. Those texts had 28 segments each, divided into 4 kinds of translation suggestions. 7 exact matches, 7 high percentage fuzzy matches, 7 low percentage fuzzy matches, all those coming from translation memories, and finally 7 machine translation feeds coming from a Moses statistical engine tuned with client-specific data. The language combination my participants were working was English into Spanish, and I had 10 professional translators, 5 men and 5 women. The data collection methods I used were of several kinds, namely keystroke logging, screen recording, face and voice recording, eye tracking, quality evaluation done by 2 professional reviewers, and post-performance interviews. The reason why I decided to focus on, to dedicate so many slides to the methodology in this presentation is because I'm using an innovative experiment, because I'm doing it in the workplace and using several data collection methods that are very challenging, namely eye tracking, especially eye tracking. So here I will explain more or less the configuration I had in the office where they were working. This is the translator's desktop computer, which was connected to a keyboard and a mouse and the monitor. So this was the computer they worked in their everyday translation tasks. What I did was to include an eye tracker here between the keyboard and the monitor, which was in front of them, but was physically connected to my laptop. In order to map what the eye tracker was capturing from their eyes with what was going on the screen, I had to capture the image coming from their computer. So I had the image going to their monitor, but also going to my computer through the splitter and a capture device. And here is where I had some technical problems with the eye tracking data, because the image I captured was not the full screen sometimes, and the data with the eye tracker and the screen image were not matching for some of the participants. So on their computer they had IBM Translation Manager, the translation tool they were using, which includes an analysis tool called MT-Eval, which IBM uses for analyzing productivity while translating and post-editing. This is basically a keystroke logger. Then I had them install input log on their computer and BB flashback. Input log is a keystroke logger, and BB flashback allows me to capture the screen, the face recording, the voice recording, and it also had a keystroke logging tool, which I used as a backup. And on my computer I had Tobii Studio installed. Tobii Studio is the software that comes with the Tobii eye trackers for capturing and analyzing eye tracking data. The experiment was divided into 4 tasks, 2 preliminary ones and 2 main ones. The preliminary tasks had the goal of warming up and having translators getting used to the experimental setup. The first task I gave them was to copy a short text from Spanish that was presented on paper into any text editor, and the goal of this task was to measure their performance while just typing, to see how many errors they made, how many characters they had to type, and the time they spent. Then they had to translate from scratch in the tool, so it was their first contact with the tool in the experiment, but without any translation suggestions. And then I had the 2 main translation tasks. Another purpose of the preliminary tasks was to calibrate the equipment. So here was where I was looking whether the eye tracking was capturing the image And in some cases I was able to fix any problems here. In some cases I noticed there was a problem, but I was not able to fix and had to go on. But these two tasks were also eye-tracked. Then the main translation tasks were a visual task where they were presented with the translation suggestions with metadata, which I'm calling the visual task, and then another one which had translation suggestions but no metadata, which I'm calling the blind task. Here we can see the visual task in a visual way. So the yellow part here is the active segment where they have the source text to be translated. Here in the middle pane they are presented with a translation suggestion. I will try to zoom in here because it's very small. Let's see if this works. Okay. So we can see on the left side a number 1. This stands for the number of the proposal. It's the first proposal, and I only had one. Then the F states for fuzzy match. Then we have the date of last usage of this proposal, and the 71 is the percentage of fuzzy match. Then in the lower pane we have some redundant information, the same metadata at the beginning of the line, and then in the middle we have the textual differences between the source text in the active segment and the source text coming from the translation memory. So this is the visual task. The blind task was done in the same tool, but here we have, let me zoom again, sorry. So here we have Spanish text. Before the yellow line, it's Spanish text that has already been processed by the translators. The yellow segment is the one they were working on at the moment the screen was captured. And below that segment we have Spanish text that is still to be processed by the translators. Here we see that we don't have any proposals and we don't have any metadata, consequently. So here at this point I have to note that even though I was looking at metadata, I was presenting them with two different tasks, and the presentation mode also came together with the fact of having metadata or not. So in one task I have metadata and dynamic insertion of suggestions, and in the other mode I have pre-translation and no metadata. So this will affect also the analysis of the results and my conclusions. So as I mentioned, I will divide the presentation of results in two parts. In the first part, I will compare the 4 tasks. So CP stands for the copy task, then scratch task, visual task, and blind task. And here I am analyzing the texts as a whole. I'm not dividing the texts into segments. This is because I want to compare the quantitative data with the qualitative data from the interviews. And in the interviews, I could ask them to compare the tasks, but not to compare individual segments within the texts, because it would be very hard for human perception to be able to distinguish between the segments. In the second part, then, I focus only on the 2 main translation tasks, the visual task and the blind task, but I can explore the results in more detail at the segment level according to the translation, the types of suggestions. So for the first part, I will present a summary of the results in form of box plots. Here we have my 3 dependent variables: translation time, typing effort, and error score. In each of the graphs, I have my 4 tasks. So this is the copy task, the translation from scratch, visual, and blind. And the same thing here for the 2 other graphs. Some observations that can be made by looking at those graphs are the following. Translation suggestions reduce translation times and typing effort, but not error scores. So these 2 tasks here, visual and blind, is where they had translation suggestions. We can see that the medians and the variations here are much lower than when they were translating from scratch. The same thing applies to typing effort. But for error scores, at least visually, we see no differences between a situation where they had some suggestions or when they were working from scratch. Another observation is that translation suggestions have a homogenizing effect on translation time. So if we look at the graphs for translation time, we see that when they translate from scratch, there is a big difference between the fastest translator and the slowest translator, and a huge variation here. But when they are presented with translation suggestions, the inter-subject variation is reduced. So they work in a more homogeneous way. And finally, by just looking at the box plot, we cannot conclude anything about metadata. So here, the medians are very similar. Here too, we see that the absence of metadata actually makes them work in a more homogeneous way too, but we cannot conclude anything here. But I will come back to the comparison of the full tasks when I mentioned the statistical analysis I did for the second part of the results. I also compared the correlation between the tasks, and I found no correlation between time, effort, and error in the copy task and in any of the other tasks. So I wanted to test whether the fastest typist was also the fastest translator or the other way around, and I couldn't find any such correlation when looking into the results for each particular subject. So one of the conclusions is that being a faster typist does not imply being a faster translator, at least in my experiment. Then I looked at the correlations within the tasks, and usually when we type, well, when they typed more, they were also spending more time, but in the visual task, where they had metadata, this was not the case. So there was no correlation between translation time and typing effort. One possible conclusion is that in the presence of metadata, typing is not what takes the most time while translating. As far as the qualitative findings are concerned, these are some of the findings I gathered from the interviews. Translators prefer to work in the visual task. They tend to trust translation memories more than they trust machine translation. Metadata increase their confidence by giving a hint on how to initially approach a suggestion. So they mentioned having different strategies for handling different kinds of suggestions, and when they know what kind of suggestion they are going to process, they can do it more easily. Translators often cannot tell apart TM suggestions from MT suggestions when there are no metadata. So for example, in the blind task, they usually, some of them assumed that there were more MT suggestions than TM suggestions, and therefore they were worse. But as I mentioned before, the proportion of TM matches and MT suggestions were the same between the two tasks. They also associated pre-translation with a revision task. In their answers, usually they said, well, in the translation task, I did that, in the revision task, I did that, even though when I planned the experiment, I was thinking of translation in one way and translation in a different way. And I also noticed that task familiarity played an important role in their preference. So one of the reasons why they preferred the visual task was also that because they're more familiar with it. Okay, so now I move to the second part of the results, where, as I said, I'm focusing on the individual segments and the 4 different types of translation suggestions. So here I'm looking only at the visual task and the blind task. For this, I used a more complex statistical analysis using mixed effects regression models. And I used SPSS as the statistics software. When I had a normal distribution of data, I used a linear regression model. And this was the case, for example, only for translation times. This is the original data set. which is right skewed, and I had to normalize it using a log transformation, and then I obtained a fairly normal distribution here and could apply linear regression. For the two other variables, typing effort and error scores, I had this kind of data distribution with a strong peak at 0, because in some cases they type no characters at all. For example, when they had an exact match, they didn't type anything, or they didn't make any errors in some of the segments. So if I apply a log transformation or different kinds of transformations, I can get a normal distribution here, but there will always be a concentration of data points on 0. So the solution I found after consultation with statisticians was to divide the analysis in 2 steps. So to use a binomial distribution for the 0 and non-zero data points, and then use a linear distribution for the non-zero data points. The variables I used in the statistical model were all that are here in this table. So in the 3 first rows, I have my 3 dependent variables: translation time, typing effort, and error score. And then I have my 2 main explanatory variables, which is task and suggestion type. And this model also allows us to include several control variables. So I used gender, I tested for gender, for text, for task order, text order, age, experience, and the performance in the copy task, time, effort, and errors. So as a result of multiple steps in this regression model, I was able to test my hypothesis. And the first set of hypotheses was confirmed that metadata does affect translation time. So this was confirmed. In the presence of metadata, the translation times were shorter. It was also found that the type of translation suggestion interacts with metadata as variable, and there was shorter translation times for exact matches and high fuzzy matches, but no significant effects for low fuzzy matches and machine translation. As for my second hypothesis, it was also confirmed, but the effect was in the opposite direction. So in the presence of metadata, there was higher typing effort. And this effect also depended on the type of translation suggestion. So for exact matches, the typing effort was actually lower, but for high fuzzy matches and low fuzzy matches, there was an increase in typing effort. And finally, for error scores, I found no significant effect for metadata or for type of translation suggestions. And if we look here, we see no significant effect for machine translation in any of the cases. But we have to remember that my metadata did not include metadata for machine translation. So only translation memories had proper metadata. Machine translation only had an indication that it was machine translation, but no further indication. Okay, so this is, now I move to the conclusion. This is a summary of the findings I have already mentioned. So, as a result of testing the hypothesis, I found that translation metadata affected translation time and typing effort, and that the effects vary according to the type of translation suggestion, as just said. In the presence of metadata, typing plays a different role in the translation process, and reducing typing may not reduce translation time. This is based on the correlation between within the tasks that I mentioned before. Metadata help translators adapt their translation suggestions according to the type of translation suggestion. This is based on their testimonials in the interviews, but also on the available eye tracking data. So where the eye tracking data was good enough to check, I tested this assumption, and I looked like at high fuzzy matches. They were actually looking at the metadata and then changing what was indicated, but not always. But they do use this information in the way they think they do. Translators prefer to work with metadata because, and here there is, actually this should be, translators prefer to work in the visual task. Because as I said, metadata was presented in the dynamic insertion environment, and no metadata was the pre-insertion environment. So is this because they perform better, or because they're more familiar with this way of working? Now, going back to one of the motivations I presented, that I wanted to see how important metadata were for comparing TM and MT in process studies. My conclusion is that this kind of studies do need to take metadata into account when comparing TM and MT. And in terms of methodology, it is necessary to find an optimal balance between ecological validity and data validity. Especially when we are dealing with realistic scenarios, as I was doing. So if we could think about a continuum between data validity and ecological validity, I was maybe at the extreme ecological validity, and for this reason, in some cases, I could not get the data with the quality I needed. As for the limitations, as I mentioned, there were some technical issues with the eye tracking setup. It was not possible to isolate presentation mode from metadata. There were alternatives, but I didn't find them to be better than the one I used, because I chose to use a typical TM workflow in one case and a typical post-editing workflow in the other case. An alternative would be to present dynamically the suggestions in the no metadata task, but then I would have to put some indication there for that suggestion. And this would also induce translators to behave differently. There was a lack of familiarity with one of the environments. Translators were used to the visual task. They were also used to revision tasks and to post-editing tasks, but not in that tool. So the fact that they were doing revision, post-editing, or translation without metadata in the tool where they usually did other kinds of tasks made them feel a little bit unfamiliar. It was difficult to elicit complete answers in the interviews. So as you see in the thesis, I put a table with all their answers for each of the tasks and the variables, and the table is not complete. This is because I chose to use a free dialogue format. Well, it was a structured dialogue format, but I was not forcing them to give an answer when they started to make comments on other topics. And so another compromise would have to be found here if I really needed the data on all the points. Quality assessment was based on subjective measures. This is usually the case in translation studies. Basically we rely on human judgment for assessing quality, and this was also the case in my study. And then there were also some natural limitations of process studies. Reduced number of subjects. In my case, I used one language combination, one text type, one translation environment, and I also found great inter-subject variation. So this affects the type of conclusions we can make and the generalizability of my conclusions. In terms of future research, I would like to investigate how metadata can help translators choose between multiple suggestions as well. In my case, I was trying not to make the setup too complex, so I was offering them just one suggestion, and I was looking at how they use that information to handle the one suggestion they had. But of course, in a more realistic scenario, they could have more than one suggestion, and metadata could also help them choose between the suggestions. And this would be something interesting to include in a future study. Also, metadata for machine translation, for example, through confidence estimation, there are some prototype tools that give some indication of metadata for machine translation, and it would be good to compare how this metadata can help them handle the suggestions. Then it is apparent from this study and other studies that there is great variation between the subjects, and of course if we had more translators we could try to profile them and take into account different translator styles and see if they behave differently according to different types of translation styles. And finally, when I mentioned the part on ergonomics, there are some other fields like human-computer interaction or workplace ergonomics that look into this specific way of presenting information on the screen and the interaction between translators and the tools in a more interface-based way. I was not looking into this here. And this was my main presentation, and I'm now open to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll proceed then immediately to the questions that might come from the panel here, and the order in which we will be asking questions is such that I will give the floor first to Professor Pilar Sanchez Dijon.
Thank you.
At the risk of her and Professor Piquet taking all of my questions.
We all formulate our questions and then he will answer afterwards.
Well, this is more or less up to you. I favor a kind of dialogue situation,
right.
so if this is in agreement with what you
no problem.
would also be prepared to engage in, I think this would be the way that I would like the defense to proceed.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to start saying thank yous to both programs. To the you are going to gain a double doctorate by the Universitat Rovira i Virgili and also by KU Leuven, and I would like to thank for the opportunity to take part in this BIVA to both programs. Particularly to the supervisors that directed your PhD. This thesis is the culmination of your training process as a researcher, and I would venture to say that you will end this training process with honors. The topic you address is of great interest in for both the industry and the academia. In fact, I would dare to say that this distinction between the industry and academia in your thesis disappears, and that is outstanding in a PhD thesis. In fact, in the humanities, like yours, the object of study address is very, very narrow. In my opinion, addressing a very narrow object is one of the strengths of your research. Because it allowed you to explore almost all the facets of the phenomenon. So your conclusions are not just a collection of hints, of evidences. I think your conclusions or your findings are a very full and comprehensive description of the phenomenon analyzed. Well, for me, every time I have the opportunity to learn, I appreciate it very much, and this has been a great opportunity to learn from your work. So thank you very much for taking me into account for this BIVA, and congratulations for the work that you have delivered and presented, because it's of great value. The structure of the thesis as such, as a research, as a piece of research, is impeccable in my opinion. It separates the research design from the description of the data obtained, and the data from the interpretation of the results. And that, in my opinion, is very rigorous, because you clearly differentiate each of the sections. At the same time, as a reader, I had the feeling that I was being told a story in which complex topics were introduced without suffer with information overload, which I also appreciate very much, because there are a lot of details here, but you just keep them one after the other, and it's very helpful to understand the results you achieve. I would like to congratulate you for the thesis as a whole, but in particular, I would like to congratulate you for the expertise shown in the delimitation of the research object, the research methods and the strategies applied, and the honesty in the presentation of the findings achieved. I would also like to congratulate you for the mastery of statistics. There is a great deal with the statistics here. And how you achieve to justify all the decisions taken. So methodologically, this is the way you describe the decisions taken. It's one of the big strengths as well of this work. Also, the figures and tables provided are very appropriate and contain the right data needed to illustrate or to summarize the particular data addressed in each of the sections. Particularly, I would like to congratulate you for the table in page 155, the one that you used in your presentations, summing up all the hypotheses, because it's a big exercise of synthesis of your work. One of the subsections I also liked very much is in the findings. Let me just mention it appropriately. Yeah, section 2.2, applicability. I like very much that you introduced a particular section on this issue in your findings, although I'll come back to this section later on. But talking about the references, there's no doubt that the literature you propose is very appropriate in all the cases. The references mentioned are in all cases of high relevance. Your theoretical framework has a very solid basis. At some points, for instance, when describing the evolution of translation technologies, both computer-assisted technologies, translation tools and MT tools, the study could have been complemented with the opinion of professionals in different points of time, because you mentioned how these tools have been changing along the time. And maybe some of these opinions could have been reflected through mentioning some papers produced by professionals at that point of time. For instance, some papers from the journal Traumatica would have been a good example of that. But never mind, this fact doesn't shadow at all the results of this research, of course. If I may go to some details of the work, when I started reading the thesis, and you started mentioning metadata of one of the main objects of research in this study, you mentioned the definition by Lucia Morado, I think, and somehow I thought that you were going to address metadata like the one like the data offered by XLEAF or things like that. I didn't really understand that you were just addressing data as where segments come from and things like that. At the very beginning, I had a small shortcut at that point, but never mind. It was clear afterwards that you weren't talking about XLEAF at all. Talking about research questions, you've got one big research question that you split into many hypotheses. The way you turn your research question into hypothesis responds to the complexity of the research object, and at the same time it's very easy to follow. Some research questions are neutral, some others aren't, but in any case the formulation of the hypothesis identifying each of the phenomena that was going to be addressed is very rigorous. That's probably one of the biggest success of this thesis as well. It allows you to specify, to detail the methodology for each, to address each of the hypotheses very rigorously. The design of the research that you propose, I think it's impeccable as well. I mean, even though the results obtained by eye tracking weren't as expected, I think all the data that you collected was enough to address the questions that the research questions that you had in mind. I would have liked to have a little bit more information about the text. If you discarded to standardize them, or to if you discarded the idea of somehow neutralize the fact that some segments may have more than one error or different kind of errors if you're going to compare them. You try to standardize them in the way that you texts are more or less equal in length, and the number of segments are the same, if I'm right, and the origin are more or less the same. The distribution is more or less the same. The kind of text included is more or less the same. But even though one text resulted to take longer to be translated than the other one, and probably there is something in the tests that could have been standardized in order to control this variable, this phenomenon. Carrying out a pilot story in your case, I think it was also a success. It helped you taking better decisions for the final test, and you also mention it in your thesis. Working with reviewers, with people who revise translation, is always a nightmare, because it's it's impossible to normalize their decisions. Even though they've got a framework, they should respect when they revise all the tests. I think this is a constant throughout studies like this. There is no agreement among revisers, and we have to learn to deal with it. About the units of measure you decided to use, I just have one question on this topic. I understand that it is necessary to normalize time spans with relation to the amount of text typed. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible to compare the results. But why did you choose to count the time in relation to 100 source words and not to a particular amount of characters? Because words might be longer or shorter. So, I don't know, would it be comparable to, would results be comparable if you would have count time in relation to 500 source characters, for instance? Or is there any reason why you decided to count it per 100 source words? And about the tools, I deduce that the use of TM-eval wasn't a previous decision made by you. It was a tool that you just it happens to be used in this environment, this scenario, and you decided to take advantage of the use of this tool, or am I wrong? So once you have been able to compare the results obtained by TM-eval and the handicaps that it also had, Do you think that research-oriented tools would improve if any of the features from TM-EVOL should be implemented in these tools? And now that I have already started with the questions, I have a couple of questions. Well, you almost close all the... you give answers to almost all the questions that you tried to solve, but at the same time you open a lot of more questions, and the questions I'm going to ask you now are more oriented to these new questions that we should address. So it's just decide which one you want to answer and which ones you just leave for the lunch. One of the objectives you mentioned at the beginning of your study is to find out whether translators are satisfied with the work they carry out. I'm not even sure if you mentioned if they are happy of the... I took note of the word happy. Do you think you have been able to observe the full complexity of this phenomenon? One very concrete, with concise question. You mentioned in page 51 project managers or file handlers. What are file handlers? What is this profile? Is it a professional profile?
I must say that I kept this term there despite of his advice. Actually, it's the term they use in IBM, and
okay.
like IBM providers also use that term. So this is why I used it. Like the quotes actually were to say it's literal. It's not that it's
Well, then probably there is a slight difference for them between PMs and file handlers. Where does this different lie? I must say that in IBM, I think they don't talk about translators; they talk about linguists. Well, in many big companies do. So they don't even see any difference between who's the one translating, who's the one revising, and who's the one doing the QA. We're just a phase in the product chain. Another concise question: as you present the blind task in page 58, it rather seems to be closer to the revision task than to the translation one. Later on, one of the participants also mentions in page 75 that is revision, what they are doing in this task. And you also equate it with revision, you equate revision and post-editing by the end of the thesis. It even seems to be stated that light revision and light post-editing are the same in page 59. So are you comparing revision and post-editing in terms of technological complexity, of what the technical assets that are being used? Or do you mean that from the point of view of the technology used during the process of revising and post-editing, these tasks may be compared? Or do you mean that, in essence, revising and post-editing are the same? I don't want to deduce or to interfere what you are trying to say there. The findings that you propose about the thesis matches, I don't know if you were surprised with these findings or you already expected them. Following the findings, in the blind task, translators took longer to edit high thesis message, and in the visual task, translators preferred to edit thesis matches rather than machine translation matches. Yeah? Mm-hmm. From the few results that you have, from the few evidences that you collected from iTracker, any hint from what they were looking at, or what they were working with? Why translators preferred to work with one of the... Well, in fact, they didn't see some of the more than one proposal at each time. They had just one of them. Yes. Then probably these results wouldn't give any light to these questions. At some point I thought that they were faced with more than one result, but in fact they didn't. Forget it. I didn't remember exactly. I worked with TM2 almost 20 years ago, and I didn't remember if it was displayed, the difference between the original segment and the original segment in the translation memory. Now that you have made it a little bit bigger, there's some information displayed. I mean, there is some visual information there, not just, but they are very separate from each other. I didn't have this information in mind when I was writing your thesis. Yeah, that's right. Did you try? Were you able to collect any hints of how they moved from one segment to from one pane to the other when editing thesis matches? Is there anything relevant that you consider worth mentioning? And talking particularly about machine translation, did you consider measuring in any way the raw empty output quality? I don't know, maybe this sample is not big enough, your sample is not big enough, but maybe it could be correlated that empty segments scoring over a particular blue or metal threshold could be compared with high thesis matches. And if so, this would be very useful finding for the industry, talking about this section, this subsection of applicability. Or did you discard to analyze empty segments from this point of view for any reason? Then during the presentation of the results, at some point it seems that the variable gender has an unexpected effect. For me, at least, it was unexpected. Finally, it seems that this effect was due to the fact that some women used a shortcut when translating exact matches. These women were very smart, probably. But did you consider to eliminate the data from these three women to evaluate the impact of the use of this Agnon shortcut? I mean, you just mentioned that without this shortcut, or without the results of these women, the differences between genders is not significant anymore when processing exact matches, particularly. But you don't mention that probably this shortcut has also an impact when evaluating exact matches in the whole study in global. Do you consider that this shortcut might have had an impact on the global results? The time spent in exact matches with in visual tasks and in blind tasks? Did you discard to eliminate these results for any reason? And the last one, you have mentioned in your presentation right now that translators seem to prefer to work with metadata. Maybe because they perform better, maybe because they are more familiar with this environment, maybe because the risk is more under control. Because somehow, when they work with a translation memory made up of human translated segments, they rely on decisions already taken by other translators. And if they know that 80% of the segment has already been validated by a human, they can focus only on these 20% remaining. But even though empty segments have the same percentage of rightness, if I may stress like this, of correctness, they don't know exactly where the mistake is, so they have to focus they can't focus on one particular couple of words. They have to focus on all the segment as a unit. Is risk, so is safety, do they feel unsafe when they work with in the blind task? And how do you think this risk may have an effect on satisfaction? One of the questions you wanted to address. As you see, there is a lot of research to be done, probably, but I think your data will give a lot of information, more information about questions like this, even though you haven't analyzed them right now from this point of view. I would like to end congratulating you again, and I would like to hear the answers that you choose to give me in this video. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pilar Sanchez. I think we're probably going to allow, as you said yourself, allow Carlos to select a little bit from your many questions, otherwise we're going to be here all day, I fear. So, Carlos, we are looking forward to hearing your selective answers to the questions.
Okay. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Sanchez, for your comments and for your suggestions. I've taken note of the suggestion for the references of other papers that take into account the use of technologies over time. I think this is also very interesting. Regarding metadata, I tried to map any study I found that had touched upon this topic, because I only found like 4 of them, and maybe I didn't phrase it clearly enough why I was mentioning them. But it's true that Lucia Morado Vasquez used the term in a broader sense, and she was looking at the XLIF standard, and this is not what I was doing. XLIF includes some of the metadata I'm using, but many more elements. So yeah, I'll try to make it clearer in the text. As far as the standardizing text and memories is concerned, well, there are many things to say here, but I tried to take an authentic text. So I was there in the company looking at several manuals and trying to choose one where I could take 2 texts that were comparable, so that the manual had to be big enough, had to be of a broad topic, not too specific, even though it was specific. And then, as I said, I took the same number of segments and divided the text in the same types of suggestions. But I didn't test neither I didn't try to standardize, for example, the segment lengths. I could have done that between, let's say, 15 words and 30 words. That would be interesting, because I think the variation would be lower in the results. But again, I would lose ecological validity, and this was my main focus there. I haven't tried to standardize the translation memories either, and this is also something that could have been done, because there were errors in the memories that have affected the results in some ways. And also, when I was doing the analysis, I could have done like a complex analysis of how the pre-existing errors affected the final errors. But so this would make everything much more complex, and I would, if I tried to standardize, I would certainly lose ecological validity, because this was the material they actually use every day. And in some cases it was interesting not to normalize, because as you said, now trying to answer something, one of your last questions, in some cases they trusted the TM because the tool was indicating that the change was in a different part. So if there was an error in the part that had not changed, they would not see it, because they were focusing on the part that had changed. So standardizing is a possibility, but you have to find a balance between an authentic text and your research goal of. So yeah, I think it's good to try to find a balance. But as a researcher, it's difficult to write the source text that you are using for your experiment. So if you want to take to be impartial, how can you, so I don't have an answer actually. I think it would be good, but I don't know exactly how to do it. The reviewers, you mentioned that it's always subjective, and I think my answer to this is that I did intra-subject comparisons. So the same reviser, even though they were subjective in the same way for all the subjects, and for a particular subject, if they consider something wrong in one task, they would consider it wrong also in the other task. And I was comparing the same subject also in two tasks. And I think this is a strong point in the research design, that I was able to do intra-subject comparisons. Because if we were comparing two groups, one in one task and another one in the other task, then the findings would be much weaker. So I think this compensates a little bit also for the reviewer's subjective assessment. MT-eval, this tool that goes with IBM Translation Manager, actually, I don't remember 100% now, but I think my goal in the beginning was to use this tool as the main keystroke logging tool. But then I realized the good thing is that since I had another tool as a backup, I noticed a difference between the two. So I wanted to use MT-eval because it was easier. It automatically gave me all the numbers I needed. But since I had the other one, I was double checking, and I found that in some cases the numbers were very different. And then I got in touch with the IBM team that developed this tool, and then I understood the difference. It's because they count the time, they count the time when they activate the segment, so the timer starts, but then they reset the counter when the translator chooses the proposal. So time starts, and then they look at the proposal, they choose number one, number two. In my case, there was only number one, but when they insert this proposal, the timer is reset. So the times I was having with MT-eval were much shorter. And of course, this thinking time, this decision time was important for me, so I didn't want to get rid of this time. So I could not use MT-eval for all I could use it for the blind task, but then I used it because they didn't have to insert the proposals, but then I used it as the backup tool, just to confirm whether what I had done more or less manually was the same as MT-eval. And I think instrumented TM tools are a good way to go. Like John Moran is proposing iOmega T and tools like that. I think they make our task much easier because you don't need to find where the segment starts and the segment finishes. The tool will give you the data you need already divided by segments. So the drawback is that you have to work with that particular tool. So if you want to have translators that are used to Trados or to another tool, you cannot use that. So, well, file handler I have asked already. I think an important question that you made, I'm glad you brought this point up is the comments about post-editing and revision. That sometimes I make no distinction and they make no distinction. And I think the answer is that the technologies themselves, TM and MT, are converging also. So there are differences when you tackle a TM suggestion and an MT suggestion, because the kind of errors that you find are different. So the kinds of changes you have to make are different. But this kind of MT system I was using, which was very specific, had been tuned after several rounds with the terminology. So it was trained with the terminology. Then every time they finish a batch of translation projects, they retune the system. And actually, I didn't present this in the thesis, but if you look at, oh no, I did present. In the appendices, you have all the translation memories, you have the suggestions and the MT. You see that the quality of the MT output is really, really high. And the changes they had to make are not the typical changes you make to like Google Translate, where some terminology is really wrong, or the problems they had were with tags, sometimes the HTML tags, and some agreements, syntactic agreements, linguistic ones. And so I think the traditional difference between revising and post-editing is trying to blur, is starting to blur now, because the technologies, not only in my experiment, but in general, are converging. So statistical machine translation, corpus-based, and TMs are not that different as they used to be in the past. And this is one of the reasons why I didn't use blue scores and Meteor. I could have done it. It would be interesting to do, but it was something I didn't know. I would have to learn, and I didn't think it was worth the effort, because the quality of the MT was high, and again, it was the same MT they were using there, so it was part of the authenticity of the project. Eye tracking did give me some hints on their behaviors. I tried to present some cases in the thesis, but since the data were so problematic in some cases, and I could use it only for some subjects, I tried not to generalize or to try to give tendencies. And I think I showed an example where one translator does look at the metadata when he had a high fuzzy match, but another one doesn't. And this could have been because, well, he actually didn't look at it, or because the how do you call that? The time I was using for the fixation limit was too high. Maybe if I had lowered the limit of the fixation, I would have seen like a 1 second fixation that was enough for him to see. So yeah, but since the data was not that good, I didn't think it was worth investing so much effort in refining the eye tracking data and seeing other tendencies. And I think the last point here will tackle. If you think there's something important that I'm leaving out, just let me know. But the gender difference. Yeah, well, you as you said, it was due to a specific practice of 3 translators, and it only affected one type of suggestion in one of the environments. I can't tell you 100% now if I did do this, but with the statistical model, I tried to eliminate outliers and things like that, and for my surprise, the results didn't change much, because it's a robust model that takes into account the subject variation as a random effect. I have to test in several steps the interaction, the main factors, but also the interaction between the factors. So apparently the model is strong enough to detect this, and the results didn't change. For many tests I did. I'm not sure about this one, but it's something that I could make sure, double check if it would change the results, because, yeah, as you said, some conclusions could be a little bit different. Okay, thank you for your opinion.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Did you have follow-up questions?
Thank you very much.
Okay. In that case, we're going to proceed to the questions, which will be asked by Professor Thank
you very much. Jo faré una intervenció en català. El professor Jacob sent una còpia en anglès, podrà seguir. I gràcies. I volia primer de tot dir una cosa que no està escrita, i és que en principi jo soc el suplent del tribunal, perquè la professora Olga Torres, que era la que de fet havia llegit la tesi, havia preparat la intervenció, i vaig usar un parell de dies, per raons familiars de salut no ho ha pogut ser, i òbviament havia de venir jo, m'ho va demanar, i a més em va passar el seu entusiasme, no l'entusiasme perquè no podia venir, sinó l'entusiasme justament per haver llegit la tesi i que li va realment fascinar. El que faré és representar la professora Olga Torres Ostenc amb la meva veu. serà la seva intervenció. I el meu paper com a membre d'aquest tribunal és jutjar si aquesta tesi compleix els requisits acadèmics i científics per a una tesi de doctorat. I en aquesta valoració faré el següent. Primer, una valoració general de la tesi. Segon, comentaré algunes curiositats que em van cridar l'atenció en els resultats. Tercer, faré unes breus consideracions per a empreses i professors i investigadors. I, per últim, formularé 4 preguntes per al candidat. Havent llegit amb atenció tota la tesi, confirmo que s'ha abordat un repte real. Quines són les diferències, si n'hi ha, en el procés de traducció entre una situació en què els traductors tenen accés a les metadades, són suggeriments de traducció, i una situació en la qual no s'ofereixen metadades. La taula de contingut està ben organitzada. La bibliografia és exhaustiva i coherent amb la metodologia del projecte. El candidat entén perfectament les perspectives tant teòriques com metodològiques incloses en la tesi. La metodologia és correcta. Les hipòtesis, les variables, per exemple, la taula de variables inclosa a l'anàlisi estadística de la pàgina 99 és molt útil, la preparació d'una prova pilot abans de l'experiment principal, el projecte en general, les eines utilitzades, diu la professora Olga Torres, que ella també va utilitzar l'SPSS per la seva tesi, i els resultats són rellevants i coherents. Pel que fa als participants, hi ha una selecció equilibrada dels subjectes, 5 homes i 5 dones, 5 més experimentats i 5 amb menys experiència, i constato que ha estat una bona idea treballar amb traductors professionals. En aquesta tesi hi ha una bona reflexió sobre el disseny de la investigació. Valoro molt els canvis fets en l'experiment principal a partir de l'experiència del pilot. Per exemple, el candidat va decidir utilitzar la velocitat de traducció, entre cometes, al pilot, i el temps de traducció, entre cometes, en l'experiment principal. L'anàlisi estadística està ben dissenyada, ben explicada i ben comentada. Valoro la inclusió no només dels resultats quantitatius, sinó també els resultats qualitatius a través de les entrevistes. L'anàlisi detallada i la escrupolositat en la presa de totes les notes de les eines d'enregistrament és impressionant. Les dades estadístiques i xifres presentades mostren que el candidat ha adquirit habilitats avançades en estadística que seran de gran utilitat en futures investigacions. El volum de dades analitzades és suficient per extraure observacions vàlides pel que fa a les hipòtesis. El candidat mostra una gran atenció pels detalls per mostrar les dades de la manera més clara possible. Per exemple, quan les dades del subjecte P9 es van normalitzar perquè les dades interferien a causa d'un mal ús del teclat, la pàgina 82 ho recull, o quan el candidat va configurar el model per provar només els efectes principals i evitar la colinealitat entre covariables, com apunta a la pàgina 102. El fet que el candidat s'esforcés per aconseguir un entorn per als traductors el més còmode possible i va permetre que els traductors utilitzessin el seu propi ordinador portàtil. És una bona idea, així apunta la professora Olga Torres, i tal com vostè recull a la pàgina 171. Pel que fa als resultats, valoro que s'hagin analitzat totes les interaccions entre variables dependents i variables independents i les correlacions entre variables. La taula de la pàgina 155 amb els resultats de les hipòtesis és realment molt útil. Les conclusions i les propostes per a futures investigacions són molt apropiades i, a més, els punts de vista crítics inclosos en les conclusions sobre la metodologia i els canvis que el candidat faria en futures investigacions són també molt útils i pertinents. Els apèndixs estan ben presentats i sobretot la llista de metadades al final és molt útil. En definitiva, es tracta d'una tesi sòlida, molt sòlida. A la tesi he trobat a més alguns resultats curiosos que m'agradaria discutir amb el candidat, diu la professora Olga Torres, en una altra ocasió. Per exemple, a la pàgina 92, el fet que els traductors van percebre la tasca visual com a traducció i la tasca sense metadades com a revisió o postedició, que ho ha apuntat també la professora Santi Gijón. També que no hi ha molts estudis sobre les diferències de gènere en aquest camp, i l'estudi fa una humil contribució a aquesta àrea, com ho recull la pàgina 103. En la pàgina 45, curiosament, hi ha un augment de temps en les coincidències exactes si no hi ha metadades i els traductors no saben que hi ha una coincidència del 100%. Això significa que els traductors estaven buscant errors. i la professora Olga Torres apunta que la Isabel La Cruz, de la Kent State University, ens va impartir un seminari la setmana passada a la UAB, en aquest cas, i ella tenia algunes dades interessants que apunten a la mateixa direcció, que es trigava més temps en posteditar els segments, com si els traductors no poguessin acceptar que un segment estigués bé. Dels resultats d'aquesta tesi m'agradaria afegir una consideració per a les empreses, una per als formadors de traductors i una per als investigadors. Per a les empreses, aquest estudi ofereix dades interessants per a prendre decisions sobre el pagament de les tasques de postedició. La postedició ha demostrat ser més ràpida, però en els resultats hi ha més errors. Això crec que és un senyal que la postedició ha de millorar, ha de ser més ben remunerada per tal d'estimular la detecció d'errors. No és una qüestió de temps, sinó una qüestió d'atenció. En segon lloc, per als professors de postedició, hem d'ensenyar consells de productivitat i eficiència? Es pregunta i pregunta. Com l'exemple de les traductores que acceptaven coincidències exactes sense llegir? Si normalment les coincidències exactes no es paguen, per què llegir-les? Tal com apunta a la pàgina 163. I per als investigadors. Els investigadors haurien de fer alguns experiments amb i sense eye trackers per comprovar l'efecte que aquestes eines poden causar en un experiment? Finalment, m'agradaria fer les següents 4 preguntes al candidat per a la discussió. A la pàgina 85. Pel que fa a la tasca de còpia i la manca de correlació amb les dades que volia observar, la pregunta és: faria servir aquesta tasca de nou en un altre experiment? Sobre els errors. En primer lloc, crec que és bo que no hi hagués molts errors. D'una banda, com indica el candidat, les memòries de traducció eren bones. D'altra banda, els participants eren professionals i se suposava que havien de lliurar una traducció gairebé perfecta. Aquests resultats no em sorprenen en absolut. En realitat, seria preocupant trobar molts errors en aquest text. Un suggeriment per a les noves investigacions sobre la qualitat de la traducció seria, per exemple, incloure alguns errors a propòsit, com unes trampes o trucs per comprovar si els detecten els traductors. En aquest cas, si ni el text ni les memòries van ser manipulades, el normal és no trobar errors. La pregunta és: per què el candidat va decidir no manipular els textos o les memòries per tal de trobar més errors? I aquest enfocament seria potser una altra tesi diferent? La tercera pregunta, o el tercer bloc, de certa manera: què pensa vostè sobre la possibilitat de fer l'experiment dins d'una empresa? Creu que a les empreses els agradaria cooperar més amb les universitats i fer algun tipus d'experiments directament a la seu de l'empresa? Creu vostè que estaven d'acord només perquè era part d'un projecte de recerca més gran i amb finançament de la Unió Europea, o que les empreses i les universitats podrien col·laborar amb aquest tipus d'experiments d'una manera regular? I l'últim bloc de preguntes, a la pàgina 184, hi ha una declaració que diu la professora Olga Torres, entre cometes, que pot portar cua. No sé com m'haurà traduït en el text en anglès. Però és interessant perquè justament és un dels temes que no fa gaire vam tenir nosaltres, o vam reproduir dins del grup telemàtic en una discussió sobre un model teòric que estàvem apuntant i que havia de presentar en un congrés. I que té a veure amb el fet següent. Diu: atès que la tendència general sembla anar cap a entorns que combinen tant memòries de traducció com traducció automàtica, serà necessari ampliar la definició de postedició per incloure aquests entorns mixtos, o bé deixar d'utilitzar aquest terme postedició i utilitzar directament la paraula traducció, ja que pràcticament ja no es tradueix sense l'ajuda de tecnologia i la majoria de les traduccions es basen en traduccions anteriors, ja siguin procedents de memòries o de traducció automàtica. No sé si pot desenvolupar més aquesta afirmació en la defensa, però per descomptat convido al candidat, un cop que sigui doctor en estudis de traducció, que elabori més aquesta declaració en l'àmbit acadèmic públic, i hi hauria aquest debat tan interessant. I l'Olga Torres Ostenga apuntava la possibilitat de començar aquest debat a l'hora de dinar. Bé, no podrà ser així, però segur que el podem fer ben aviat perquè, per sort, el professor Teixeira, el doctorant, està participant en una activitat dintre de l'Autònoma, juntament amb altres companys aquí. Bé, per concloure, diré que és una bona tesi, ja que respon a qüestions útils per a la indústria de la localització. Agraeixo al candidat i al seu director, els seus directors, aquesta valuosa contribució als estudis de traducció i la meva més sincera enhorabona en nom de la Paula Torres i també meves. Gràcies.
Okay, as agreed, I will answer in English so the audience can understand.
Com tu trobis més còmode.
Very kind of you.
Yes, the President requested that explicitly. Thank you very much for your personal comments and for representing Dr. Torres here. I think if she were present, probably she would have thought about other questions during the presentation because some of them match what she had said. So I will try to make some extra comments on that, but I appreciate the points that have been raised. The fact of why I did not manipulate the translation memories or the text, well, I focused my answer on the text because this is what you asked, and she's asking about the memories. And actually, one of the reasons was, well, the main reason was because I didn't want to manipulate just to avoid removing any authenticity from the material. But also because I saw that they were indeed not perfect. There were errors there that were interesting. So, and I used those errors when analyzing some of their behaviors. So there were some spelling mistakes, there were some agreement mistakes in the sentences. So I did not need to include any tricks because they were already there. So it's not because it had been revised by other translators or that had already been approved by the project manager that they were free of errors. They did have some errors. So this is, yeah, this would be the complement to the question I gave before, why why I choose not to manipulate the material. The first question, I'm not sure if I understand correctly. Did she ask if I would include the copy task again in another experiment, considering that in this case it did not prove to be meaningful? Is this what she?
I think in this sense.
Yeah. I think I would include it. I think I would include it because even though it did not prove to be significant in that case, another study with other subjects, with other tools, and I think we could be surprised with results. As I said, not all the findings, or very few findings, are generalizable to all translators in all contexts. And I think this is a good activity because it doesn't contain the translatorial component. I mean, if we think that translation is mechanically divided into thinking and typing, in this case you're just typing. So you see something and you type it here. Of course you have to think, but it's not the translator kind of thinking. So you don't need to convert anything from one language to the other, you just type. So I think it's good to compare this activity, mechanical activity, with the other components we have in translation. So even though I did not explore this very deeply, I was just looking at this correlation, I think it's a good task to include. And it also serves as a warm-up activity. So they can relax, they considered, they were not, they had not started the experiment yet because they were just copying something in Spanish. So I think it's good for them to relax and to forget about the eye tracking there, and yeah, so I would include it. The possibilities between carrying out experiments in companies. We had a seminar last week, and Dr. Sanchez was present too, as a conclusion of the European project of which I'm part. One of our goals was to establish this correlation, this relation between academia and the industry. So we had a full day of discussions about the possibilities of establishing such cooperations. It's a very tricky relation. in my case, there were two companies that were partners in the project originally. So this company where I did the experiment was not one of the members of the project. I had, well, we had to change. I mean, the two original ones did not accept the experiments because of confidentiality issues, because of financial issues. They thought they would spend too much time with me that would not be worth the money the project could pay them. So I think it's a very important thing to do, but it's very difficult to achieve. So the company needs to be interested in research. They must have, well, we must actually try to offer something very concrete to them. Usually businesses are money oriented, so if they can take some profit from their, like an innovative way of doing things, or cost savings, or even reputation. The fact of that I was working in a small company that was a provider for a big company, so the fact that they were collaborating with a European project also served for them as an increase in reputation. So they were interested in research, of top-level research with top-level equipment. So yeah, we have to find ways of collaborating. I think collaboration is important, but difficult to achieve. And finally, the distinction between translation and revising and post-editing, I also mentioned there. And she included a good point that I think we should talk about translation. Because translation is done with technologies, and of course there are differences if you do with translation memories, with machine translation, the type of tool, but I don't think it's necessary to divide it in this way. Of course, when machine translation started, it was a different type of technology, the uses were different, but nowadays I think it has come to the mainstream workflow of translation as we know it, and it doesn't make sense to distinguish it with enthusiasm. It could be interesting for some specific cases, but not as, I don't think it's an important distinction.
Okay, and thank you very much. Okay, and we've already heard how my colleagues on either side have sung your praise, and we've even heard that you have succeeded in producing impeccable research, and I'm not going to try and make it peccable, if there is such an adjective, but I will try, if I can, to well, to challenge you on a few points. And I'm going to do this differently because most of my questions have been taken already. We've all been struck by the performance of these three very smart ladies in your group, and this one very slow male, who of course affects your results in the opposite, or no, increases the distance on the gender parameter. But in general, what I would like to say by way of introduction is that your research has been built around one central intuition, and I congratulate you on that. One central intuition or one central curiosity, stemming from your personal experience as a translator, and this is the effect of metadata on translator performance. So this provides great focus in your work. Some might say a narrow focus, you mentioned that, but in a positive way, because you succeed in convincing us of the centrality, and you build wider and wider circles of importance from that center. Formally, I think your report is excellently structured also, both formally but also with respect to content. So your research question is very clearly formulated. Your three main hypotheses and their associated sub-hypotheses. Your English is fine. I think I would also like to congratulate you on the way in which you succeed in maintaining a good balance between, let's say, lab considerations versus workplace considerations, where you've done your utmost to create a situation from the workplace which would have direct relevance to a workplace situation in the industry, and nevertheless subjecting that to extreme control, especially statistically, I would say. The balance between ecology, as you call it, and data quality, where occasionally you've had to compromise on the quality of the data that you were able to obtain, not just because you wanted to have data from a workplace situation, but also because you had quite a complex technological setup with image splitter and stuff that was bound to give problems, I would say. And I know what it's like having to work with eye trackers and stuff. They are extremely intolerant of everything. You give a very clear account of your methodology, both in the pilot and in the main experiment. I would say the very different main experiments. I'm going to maybe come back to that a little bit. You account for all the hassle you had with getting your technological data recording and all of that to work. Your data analysis, I think, is exemplary. You have technically very fine statistics using linear mixed effects regression in particular, logarithmic transformation and this and that. You handle all of that supremely well. You have statistically significant results on 4 of your 6 main hypothetical elements, which is fine. And then, of course, there is the question of statistical significance versus, let's say, wider importance for the translation industry, socially, ergonomically, emotionally, all of that. And of course, interpretation is always open, and therefore open to discussion, I hope, and I would say fortunately. So I'm not going to comment on the initial chapters, they're fine, but I would like to go to the methodological chapter 4 and ask you in what sense your pilot study was indeed a pilot study for the main study. So I don't know where this is going to end, therefore I'm going to ask you to answer that question now.
Yes, I think you picked an important aspect. Actually, the main experiment and the pilot experiment were separated not only in time, but also in some of the methodology. And even though I tried to do some tests in the company, which are not reflected in the pilot experiment I present in the thesis, I think the experience I had previous to the main experiment was not enough to show me all the errors, all the problems that I faced when conducting the real experiment. I know this is no excuse, but as I said, we were collaborating with the company. We had several constraints. I mean, the time I could be there because we had agreed some dates, the availability of the translators, the fact that summer was approaching, and you know, in Spain usually some months are not very productive. Yeah, that's true, and it's already foreseen. So we had a schedule. So I could not use, for example, a week to conduct experiments and process the data and check that everything would be analyzable as expected. I did have time to get in touch with Toby's support to try to fix the problems that I had identified, but if I missed that opportunity of doing the experiment in that company, at that specific set of weeks, I had like 2 or 3 weeks for starting, I would probably miss the opportunity for the whole period of the doctoral thesis, because finding another company to partner and changing all the methodology I had already envisaged was not something I was considering. So the take I decided to follow was to accept some of the possible problems and focus on the other research methods I was using. So I knew that the eye tracking, the keystroke logging, and the other parts I was using had been proved before and would be fine. And the only potential big problem was eye tracking. And because I had this time pressure, let's say, I decided to go on like this. But I reckon that it would have been important to do a proper pilot in that environment, and then take some time to analyze the data, fix some problems, and then go back to the company and do the main experiment. Yeah, even though I would also lose some subjects because it was hard to find 10, so I could use 2 for the pilot and then 8 for the main experiment, or give those 2 a different text, but then they would already have done the task before. It was difficult to find a solution for this, and yeah, this is the reason why the pilot is not, the pilot presented in the thesis is not a pilot of the main experiment in the traditional
And
sense.
it just goes to show that sometimes there is fine serendipity in practical circumstances,
Right.
forcing you
Yes.
in an unexpected direction, I think. I asked myself also, seeing the results that you got from the pilot experiment, what made you go on? What made you go on? Because the results were not the ones that you expected, especially from your second participant in the pilot project. So you must be a believer of some kind in this intuition that you had. Or were you convinced that you had the right question, the right research question after the pilot?
Now you're referring to the pilot that is actually presented in the thesis,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Well, I found that the difference between the subjects was very high, and this is probably what you were referring
Yes.
to. Yes. But I was not conducting like a sociological study. I was more interested like in the psychological phenomena happening during the translation. And I think actually my curiosity was even higher after I did the pilot, because I really wanted to know how the processes worked. And this is one of the reasons why I decided to include the eye tracker, because only looking at the numbers there of the keystroke logging and the times did not give me some explanation. So I thought that by including eye tracking, besides the fact that it would allow me to have a more precise measurement of the time they started working in the segment and finishing working in the segment, it will also give me some hints on what they were looking at, and so I don't see that.
Okay, fine.
This could have.
I would say that your curiosity was stronger than your initial intuition, perhaps there. And this is fine. This is the passion for research, I think, that comes out there. Originally, terminologically, you spoke about provenance rather than metadata. Can you just briefly explain why you decided to use metadata rather than provenance? I think Professor Sanchez would more easily have understood provenance than metadata.
Yeah, when I used provenance, I was thinking about where the suggestion came from.
Yes.
So if it was translation memories or machine translation. But I thought it was too restrictive.
Yes.
Because actually that information was not only about where the suggestion came from, but also it included other information like the quality of the translation memory matches and the parts of the segments that had changed. So I think metadata is a more appropriate term because it includes more information, not only the provenance. This is the main reason why I changed.
Yes. And you recorded data, of course, from all kinds of sources, not necessarily related to provenance. You recorded, for instance, facial expression also. You tell us, did you use any of that information?
No, I used it for checking, for example, when I had some pauses, I wanted to know if they were looking there. I mean, in case the eye tracking was not showing something, or if they were looking away of the screen. So this is the way I actually looked at the face recording data. So I was watching the performance, and whenever they were not looking at the screen because someone called, since we were in a real workplace setting, sometimes they were just talking to someone because the project manager came to ask something really quickly. So they knew we were doing the experiment, but of course, or the phone rang, and they were distracted for, 3 seconds. So this is the way. But I think this data could be used to try to find more if they were like surprised with something, or there is a potential for exploring this data, I think.
Sure. There was a question from Professor Piquet concerning the profitability of including the copy task, and you were surprised, I think, by the timing of the typing in the copy task. I was wondering if it is an entirely fair comparison there, because if you look at the length of the copy task, I think it was only 52 words or something very short in comparison with the translation task.
Mm-hmm.
It was also the first task that you asked them to do. It was not one that they were used to doing. So there are many factors contributing to slowing down the speed with which they were doing this potentially. But I think it is very important nevertheless to have included this, because one of the really important conclusions that you come up with is the relative insignificance of typing skills in all of your results, in fact. I think that is of key importance. I have one comment. It has been commented on already concerning this business of translation versus revision. I think you may have contributed yourself, despite what you said. In your mind, both of these tasks were related to or conceptualized as ways of translating. But if you look at the instructions that you formulated, if my Spanish is good enough, you yourself made a distinction that invited them to think in terms of translation versus revision. Appendix 7 and 8, sir, if you want to look at it. Page 218 and 219. Just remind us what you said or wrote in the instruction.
Yes. So the first one says that
just the last 2 lines. Tu tarea.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay. Tu tarea consiste en traducir, and in the blind, tu tarea consiste en revisar. Don't you think that you may have invited this conceptualization?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
And I didn't notice, actually.
You didn't?
Yeah, I thought, no, it can't be. I was looking here. It was like a slip, I think. I should have said your task consists in translating in both cases. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for pointing this out.
I was thinking also about the importance of the difference in the way in which translation suggestions were presented. in relation to this conceptualization of whether it was a translation or a revision task. And also in relation to the timing of all of this, because in the blind task, suggestions were already there. They didn't have to be inserted. They were not presented as a translation suggestion in a way. They were presented as a finished translation. And you don't really consider how much this may have influenced the operations that they made on this text. And I was wondering if you would reconsider that. I was going to ask you, my final question, I'm not going to ask it, was, suppose this was your pilot for a real study, okay, a bigger study. What would you do differently? I'm not going to ask that, except perhaps in one respect. Because you were surprised by the effect on text. And I was surprised also. And I was also a little surprised that you do not seem to actually locate the source of this. There are many potential sources, and I think it was indicated a little, or suggested a little bit already, that maybe if one looked into the individual segments, relating it to individual participants in your project, it would be possible to locate this and speculate on what made this surprising result, this surprising outcome.
So where the differences were between the two texts, right?
Yes.
Where exactly it
What
happened?
made this surprising difference? Could it be in perhaps just a single segment, one or two? And I was expecting that you, I mean, with your thoroughness in general, that you would pursue this all the way. And I didn't find that.
Thank you for the suggestion.
So, yeah. And I don't know where to look for it. I just noticed that I was very curious to see what, and you do promise a discussion also of this on page 113. I've noted that you promise a discussion in section 628, and then I read section 628 and wondered where this discussion was. You don't completely fulfill that promise, I don't think. But it's a very minor point in the entire context, obviously. Another small question concerns one that has also been touched upon already, concerns the machine translation items, the segments that you use. At least 4 of them, of the 5, are very high quality, either exact matches or the equivalent of exact matches or very high fuzzy matches. I'm wondering if it would have been interesting to manipulate the quality of the machine translation suggestions a little bit, because obviously if it's possible to automate the process and just accept any exact match, and even automatically, that is not possible if you don't have the metadata. That goes without saying. You've got to read it, at least, before accepting. And in the 5 examples that you give, that you select for special attention and that you analyze both quantitatively and qualitatively very well, there's only one example of the machine translated items which is really a little bit problematic, and mainly I would say because of the tags that you have to read across. There are 3 small things that need to be corrected. But there's not much support for somebody who believes that that machine-translated suggestions are unreliable, because they are very highly reliable, in fact, more reliable than most of the low fuzzy matches that you give. Did you consider including one really rotten suggestion from the machine, or were you unable to produce one?
For machine translation?
Yes.
I didn't manipulate anything.
No.
But now I think that it would have been interesting to have machine translation at the same 3 levels I had for TM.
Exactly.
Maybe like perfect matches, high quality matches and lower quality matches, and then compare
with confidence measures.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Definitely.
Okay. You have many really nice explanations, I think, also. There's your second sub-hypothesis, which is a little bit surprising, that the presence of metadata is beneficial for exact matches, but apparently detrimental, you write, for high fuzzy matches, and very close to being detrimental also with respect to low fuzzy matches. I'm wondering about the explanation you give on page 153, how good it is. Let me just see if I can find it and remind you. An explanation, this is near the top of 153.
Okay.
Line 6. An explanation could be that when metadata are not available, translators tend to overlook some necessary changes and fail to implement them, thus reducing the amount of editing. Then you write, one would expect that the failure to make the necessary changes would result in higher error scores, and I would. But this is not confirmed by the results. Okay, this is your honesty, if you like. But it's not a good explanation then, is it? How is this possible?
Yeah, especially, well, for the high fuzzy matches, it would be possible because there are few errors in the matches, so if they don't fix them, it's still okay.
Yeah.
But for the low fuzzy matches, of course, you can have, how would I explain that? Yeah.
Well, you resort to what I think we all do when we are in a fix like this. You say that further investigation is necessary. Right?
I forgot this part.
Okay. So, I'm coming to the end now. Your conclusion with respect to applicability, I really like. Also, you comment on the limitations, and in a way you do exactly what I was going to ask you, to treat your own work as a kind of pilot for further studies. You indicate avenues for further research, and as you mentioned in your own introduction also, you would like to do a follow-up study with multiple suggestions, and take account of translator styles, perhaps, which of course have been studied, as you mentioned, by Sylvain Davidson and others, in Kazmakat also. I think one of the previous PhD candidates, Kyriaki Kuruni, has also taken an interest in that, and Maureen Ehrensberger is interested in that, and also in what you have mentioned, ergonomics, the ergonomics. And this brings me back to your epigram from your supervisor in this place. Why did you give your supervisor such a prominent position in your thesis as to quote him in an epigram? Are you aware of the honor that is being? You must be embarrassed. Tell us why you decided to do that.
It was hard to find an epigram. And I really like the human part of the research, because even though this was one of my main concerns, well, just for the audience, it's just one sentence. It's what we gain in productivity, we risk losing humanity. Yes, something like that. So the focus of process studies is usually productivity. The main focus, productivity, and then quality, because you don't want to lose quality, well, just for the sake of being more productive. But the human aspect was what attracted me to do the research. I mean, what was in it for the translator? So if metadata was positive and they were forced to work in a different way, should we still be doing this kind of things? So, but then when we go into the data and we see numbers, speed, and so the tendency is to go back just to productivity. And so I think it was a sentence that summarized this balance I was trying to find between looking into numbers and productivity, but remembering that one of the main goals for me was to think what this could be of use to the translators. And I think this is what explains more or less the...
And I think this is wonderful. I feel that universities are being subjected to productivity criteria more and more. I feel that in the industry also, productivity criteria tend to be dominant, and it's wonderful if some kind of counteraction could evolve, a counterculture, if you like, could evolve, which would make the kind of study that you have engaged in, and makes it into a true piece of research in the humanities. So thank you very much, Carlos. And many thanks to everybody. I'm going to send you all out now. No?
Doctors can say
Oh. Okay, you teach me the regulations here. Doctors can comment.
No? Okay.
Well, you've been given the chance.
On my feet. Okay, is blind versus visual. And visual is best. That's the final take you get from your research. Is visual first? Is visual best?
Best. It depends. If you are just post-editing machine translation, and now I'm using the term post-editing, it doesn't improve. It can even make it worse, because you have to dynamically insert the suggestions. So it's okay to work with a typical post-editing environment where you just fix what you find there. But if you are working in a mixed scenario, which was my focus there, where you have TM and you have MT, usually you have a high percentage of translation memory matches there. Then it tends to be beneficial to use to have metadata and this workflow where you can dynamically insert things. So it depends on your material, but if you want to generalize, it is better to have the metadata. If the traditional system we know with the TM workflow, with dynamic insertion, and especially the way the elements are arranged on the screen, this is why I'm interested in ergonomics. I don't think this is necessarily the best way, but metadata seems to be a really important feature.
Very briefly, because we have to go to lunch. This is part of the European Marie Curie Intensive Training Network, co-supervisor Reina Meiletz from Leuven. We've benefited enormously from this, from the funding. It's somebody giving you an embarrassing amount of money to train doctoral candidates well. And the great risk is that we won't find people up to the task. In this case, there was no risk. Carlos has worked very hard, harder than almost any doctoral candidate I've had over the years. One small anecdote, some months ago he came and said, look, there's a small mistake in my data that I put in. I have to rerun all the tests, do all the calculations again. I say, how long is it going to take you? 2 weeks if he works hard. With anyone else, I might have said, look, they won't notice. But I didn't even try with Carlos because he is meticulous, incredibly thorough. He's entirely the opposite from me, and I appreciate all those qualities. And I didn't even try to tell him. I said, go ahead, fix all the data, do it properly. He's done it very properly, and we're very proud of the result. It's been great to have him with us these years. You can tell the members of the department who've come here to support him, his family, even my wife is trying to support him now. It's also been a social addition to our department, and very much appreciated. Thank you all for your...
May I ask 2 words
Yes,
also?
please.
And I never contradict you, Anthony, as you might know. Thank you. It was a pleasure working with you, Carlos, in the project as a whole, to which you brought a lot. I agree. And as you mentioned yourself in the thesis, you are a perfectionist. This is an advantage, perhaps also sometimes a disadvantage. But anyway, this brought a lot of things into the project, and again, congratulations with a wonderful piece of work. I'm very happy with the joint degree, with the go to tell, like we call it. And people will not have noticed that next to this very beautiful Rovira I Virgili copy, there is another copy according to KU Leuven standards. So you are really like the perfect go-to-tell student, and perhaps I'm the only one who have seen it here today. You are behind your desk with your Rovira I Virgili copy. You're writing with a KU Leuven pen.
Oh, that's true.
Perfect, Carlos. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I was hoping that there would be evidence about how difficult it must have been to supervise Carlos as it did. So can I now send you all out, and we will convene and assess. Thank you very much, all of you.